Gaga Grumps says welcome gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily hearts, claim your points and prepare to play. Gaga Grumps says hi there Billy Bob.
Game gremlins on the scene. Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a calling for your daily hearts.
Game gremlins on the scene. Welcome gremlins to the game grotto. Welcome gremlins to the game grotto. Welcoming guys.
Gaga Grumps says welcome gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily hearts, claim your points and prepare to play.
Tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, it's your warm-up routine. Game gremlins on the scene. Game gremlins on the scene. Game gremlins on the scene. Game gremlins.
Gaga Grumps says hi Haruna. How goes it?
Now tap that screen. Tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it. Game gremlins come and let's go. Now tap that screen. Tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it. Let's see those team stickers flow. Game gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says Rai in the house, thanks for doing your daily hearts.
Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen. Game gremlins on the scene.
Grumps says welcome one and all.
Gaga Grumps says okay, who's ready to play Wordle?
Rare says yes.
Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Gaga Grumps says this is not today's Wordle.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says Crystal in the house, thanks for doing your daily heart.
Billy Bobber says almost guessed it.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. J.
Thanks for the follow.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word. Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Grumps says a crystal R. Off work today. I'm guessing higher.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with J, please, Rai. Crystal says at Grumps, yes, thank God.
Ware says dagger.
Gaga Grumps says not close enough, my dad. Gaga Grumps says Jaeger you got.
Thanks for the follow.
Oscar says plank.
Thanks for the follow.
Ware says a line.
Gaga Grumps says TT Throttles likes everyone suffers from it at some point. Gaga Grumps says a yellow A in need of a home.
Oscar says plank.
Gaga Grumps says plant fits.
Dexter.c says why no thank you.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says Oscar in the house. Gaga Grumps says cause I hadn't seen it yet, Dexter, thanks for the roses. I appreciate it. Gaga Grumps says we added a homeless T to our A. Gaga Grumps says I am non-speaking, there is a pinned post on my page explaining. Gaga Grumps says no R for track.
Mohammed 1ALK says shut up.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says fatty.
Rai says today.
Gaga grumps says tea can't be last fatty.
Crystal says today.
Gaga grumps says today works.
Oscar says maybe fireworks.
Mohammed 1 Alk says yes.
Gaga grumps says and we added a homeless oh lol.
Thanks for the follow.
Gaga grumps says no one wants to live anywhere.
Mohammed 1 ALK says 67 kid.
Gaga grumps says no plurals in Wordle.
Crystal says Ada.
Rory says quota.
Gaga grumps says not sure it'll be valid, but let's give it a spin.
Max 12 says aorta.
Max HD12 says never mind.
Oscar says Buddha.
Rai says quota.
Jimmy says quota.
Gaga grumps says quota is a shout.
Oscar says ONVM.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga grumps says Jimmy in the house.
Jimmy says it Gaga and grumps whoop whoop.
It's playtime! Gaga is in the box!
Gaga grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Grumps is on the buttons!
Rai says a Billy Bob is when you get a prize or something.
Are you ready to play? Let those stickers fly! Which team are you on? Team Gaga, give a cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps, are you steady? Game Gremlins, let's go! Game Gremlins, let's go! Team Gaga,
Gaga grumps says do the do to Gaga. Share the live, chat the chat, and shower her with roses and GGs.
Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps, are you steady? Game Gremlins, let's go! Good game. Gremlins, let's go! Game Gremlins, let's go!
Gaga grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next group.
Gremlins, let's go!
Max HD12 says Batman Blue and Future the Russian breakfast.
Let's go!
Gaga grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Max 12 says Anton.
Max 12 says I will be the letter.
Grumps says Anton aus Tirol.
Gaga grumps says we are starting with A. T.
Max 12 says truce.
Gaga grumps, says Rai on the nose. Gaga grumps, says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Grump says that my dad dance ACC. We can do here.
Max 12 says, what was that sound?
Max 12 says there's a racial slur.
Grump says that Muhammad 1 up thirsty is 2 letters too many.
Gaga grumps, says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list.
Max 12 says in that sound, there was a racial slur used.
Grump says that Billy Bob's related.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Grump says that Max 12, what are you on about?
Max HD12 says that's right, underscore sound. Gaga grumps, says it just says ding ding ding, doesn't it?
Miss Elania says happy Saturday.
Grump says that Misk underscore Ella underscore Nias higher.
Gaga grumps, says are your words starting with T please Rai.
Max 12 says maybe I am mistaken, but I heard something else.
Miss Galania says at Grumps High.
Rai says taser.
Miss Elania says precious in the house.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga grumps, says I will check sound later, but as far as I know it just says ding 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 for on the nose. Gaga grumps, says taser you got.
Benjamin is in the house.
Grump says at Max 12, only you that heard anything of that sort.
Gaga grumps, says precious in the house, thanks for doing your daily heart.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Max HD12 says it was the sound that said that's right and then something else.
Thanks for the follow.
Max 12 says YS.
Max 12 says at RH end.
Max 12 says IT says the M word.
Gaga grumps, says yellow tea in need of a home. Jimmy says build.
Rare says glint.
Miss Galania says at Max HD12, no it doesn't.
Jimmy says built.
Thanks for the follow.
Jimmy says built.
Oscar says clout.
Jimmy says build.
Max 12 says play the sound again.
Gaga grumps, says sound is disabled for now to check later.
Rare says no at chat.
Oscar says clout.
Jimmy says built.
Max 12 says that Gaga and Grump's okay.
Miss Galanius says optic.
Grump says at max 12 I shall not, on the off chance you are right. We will look into it after the game.
Jimmy says built gives you a chance of vowel.
Max 12 says okay. My apologies.
Gaga Grumps says optic fits.
Miss Galania says booth.
Oscar says at Real Linux no spoilers.
Grump says at max 12 no worries, well check it out later.
Rai says doubt. Gaga Grumps says we added a homeless O. We like the yellows today, don't we?
Jimmy says that came so late.
Gaga Grumps says can't be topic.
Rare says at Alex_Thebrookworm, no T at start.
Gaga Grumps says booth works.
Rory says doubt.
Miss Kelania says boot why.
Jimmy says booty.
Gaga Grumps says thought we had fireworks then.
Jimmy says booty.
Gaga Grumps says damn it boots is a pair. Let's try booty first before the plural.
Rory says Wasso delayed.
Jimmy says your booty does a tootie.
Crystal says at Rory, it was last night, also.
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says yeah it must be tickfinity. Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Good game.
Grump says at Manchester 13 height.
Gaga Grumps says do you do the daily Wordle? I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says Manchester in the house.
Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next
Good
one.
game. Good 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 game.
Gaga Grumps says
Good
thanks for the
game.
GG's Crystal.
Good game. Good game. Good
Gaga
game.
Grumps says let's play Wordle.
Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says thanks for the GG's Rai.
Grump says it ill creative one higher.
Well, creative one says it. Grumps here.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. G for GG's.
Well, creative one says Grump.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says creative in the house. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Well, creative one says hi, Gaga.
Like-a-thon, race to the top, like-a-thon, tap and don't stop, like-a-thon, who will be crowned, like-a-thon, gremlin renowned, like-a-thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Everybody get down! It's a freaking sniper!
Grump says the cheek of some people.
Crystal says yep.
Gaga Grumps says he thought he had it but instorms Crystal with the crown.
Miss Galania says, oh, Crystal said not today, Rumps.
Well, creative one says Grump.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with G please Crystal, I wonder what it will be.
Grump says at misk_Ella_Neas the consequences shall be dire.
Crystal says at Missy_Ella_Neas at Waspe back lol.
Gaga Grumps says hi there April.
Crystal says Grump.
Misk Ella_Neas says at Grumps.
Gaga Grumps says Grumpy Bit.
It's a Wordle wipeout.
Grump says at Crystal I shall look at you with a side eye.
Let us to shout.
Gaga Grumps says wipeouts in the chat.
Crystal says wipeout.
Oh no.
Crystal says at Grumps lol.
Gaga Grumps says, and he gave us nothing lol. Gaga Grumps says no Arthur Solar.
Crystal says when Ray passed me, I knew it had no choice but to.
Grumps says, how the frack did I just wipe myself out of the live? That was new.
Gaga Grumps says steak fits.
O Creative One says point.
Gaga Grumps says lol, a double wipeout for Grumps. Gaga Grumps says a yellow E in need of a home.
Rory says loved.
Grumps says at Gaga, and Grumps is the vindication for the usurping.
Gaga Grumps says no A for dance. Gaga Grumps says no S for noise.
O Creative One says flown.
Crystal says belly.
Nope.
Gaga Grumps says loved works.
Grumps says at Cook WKC. No S and no plurals.
Hailey B says clone.
Pudding the Great says we got the E.
Gaga Grumps says E lives at number 4 and L needs a home.
Grumps says at Hailey B no O.
Gaga Grumps says no O for clone.
Rare says wheel. Rare says jewel.
Gaga Grumps says wheel is a good shout.
Crystal says jewel.
Hailey B says that Rai oh good one. Gaga Grumps says looks like jewel was a better shout.
Rory says try jewel.
Welcome, Gremlins,
Good game.
to the game grotto.
Will Creative One says jewel.
To the game grotto. Welcome in, guys. Settle down.
Good game.
Grab your heartbeat.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Yeah, tap it. It's your warm-up routine. Game Gremlins on the scene. Game Gremlins on the scene. Game Gremlins
LL
on the
Creative
scene.
One says Wordle.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says welcome Gremlins to the game grotto. We'll take a seat, grab your game cards, claim your points and prepare to play.
Now tap that screen. Tap it, tap that screen. Yeah, tap it.
Creative One says at Cook WKG Wordle.
Rory says trying to play and make a copy law.
Now tap that screen.
Grumps says at Cook WKC. TikTok.
Now tap that screen.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart, Haley. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Grumps says at Rai the two most important tasks in the morning.
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Grumps says at Lucas O.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. G again.
Grumps says at Haley B.
Haley B says no.
The creative one says no.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thon, race to the top. Like a thon, tap and don't stop. Like a thon, who will be crowned? Like a thon, gremlin renowned. Like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list.
Grumps says at Pudding for Great Audio is a Wordle non grata.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Nope.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with G, please, Rai.
Grumps says at Colin Body no plurals.
Gaga Grumps says welcome back, my dad.
Rory says gamer.
Gaga
We would be
Grumps says
honored
gamer you got.
if you would join us.
User 5698 says graph.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Gaga Grumps says we have a yellow E and R in need of homes and it's not an R word. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart, Clarion user.
User 5698 says retry.
Crystal says reply.
Haley B says drape.
Gaga grumps says can't be gripe, can't be cream.
User 5698 says cream doesn't work.
Rai says no chat. Gaga grumps says reply fits.
What creative one says rerun?
Gaga grumps says no change. 6 letters wiped from the game.
Rory says crone.
Gaga grumps says cream doesn't work, there is no A.
User 5698 says filler.
Or Creative One says fries.
Gaga grumps says crone works. Gaga grumps says we start with C and end in E.
Rory says curve.
The creative one says curve.
Gaga grumps says curve is a good shout.
You says cassettes.
Rory says curse.
Gaga grumps says nearly.
LL Creative One says curse.
Haley B says curse.
Gaga grumps says checking for options.
Rory says at Ely, huh.
Gaga grumps says don't see a trap.
Grumps says at Illy, what are you on about?
It's playtime! Guys in the box!
Or Creative One says curve.
Don't let her loose!
Good game.
Grumps is on the buttons! Don't let him push yours!
Good game.
Are you ready to play?
Gaga grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Which team are you on? Team Gaga,
Or Creative One says at Gaga and Grumps.
Team Gaga, are you
Good
ready?
game.
Team Grumps, are you steady? Game! Gremlins, let's go! Game!
Gaga grumps says doo-doo for Gaga. Share the live chat the chat and shower her with roses and GGs.
Good game.
Team Grumps, are you
Good game.
Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps,
Good
are you
game.
steady? Game! Gremlins, let's go!
Good game.
Game! Gremlins,
Good
let's
game.
go! Game!
Good game.
Gremlins, let's go!
Good game.
Game! Gremlins, let's
Gaga grumps says nice
Good
lights.
game. Good game.
Game! Gremlins, let's go!
Good game.
Gaga grumps says if
Good
you haven't
game.
done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the GG's Crystal.
Thanks for the follow.
Or Creative One says G again.
Gaga Grumps says and the Rose Creative. Rai says ill sit the tapping, give someone else a chance. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says TTS throwing out errors again. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. A. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Race to the top like a thon. Tap and don't stop like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with a please Grumps.
Grumps says I'll.
Clary86 says apple.
Gaga Grumps says I'll you got. Gaga Grumps says AS and E in need of homes.
A creative one says every other letter.
Gaga Grumps says Steam fits.
Rare says feast.
Well, Creative One says stare.
Gaga Grumps says and they are all homed.
Haley B says speak.
Grumps says sneak.
Rare says spear.
Creative One says sheer.
Gaga Grumps says speak works. Gaga Grumps says filter for options.
Rory says swear.
Creative 1 says sheer.
Grumps says at my dad dance ACC. Thought I felt a presence.
Rare says worth.
Gaga Grumps says worth is good.
Creative 1 says sheer.
Gaga Grumps says sheer we have.
Rory says sheer.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Good game.
Grumps says that Colin Body called the sheer early on.
A random star chosen by fate. Play a part, it's a live date. Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says do the daily Wordle. I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results. Gaga Grumps says W's for Colin who called sheer early.
A pretty sky. Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next one.
Rare says we need to see the fireworks.
Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says yep, where are my fireworks? Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Welcome IDK to Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. J.
Benjamin is in the house.
Welcome
Gaga
Elliot to
Grumps
Wordle with
says
Gaga.
IDK in the house. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Race to the top like a thon. Tap and don't stop like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned like a thon. Fingers on fire like a thon. Gremlins
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe these. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Gaga Grumps says creative back on top. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with J, please creative. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart IDK and Louis.
A creative one says jelly.
Grumps says at my dad dance ACC. Can always snipe.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the rose creative. Gaga Grumps says jelly you got. Gaga Grumps says a green L moved into number 4 and another needs a home. Gaga Grumps says shall fix.
Grumps says at my dad dance ACC. Then the power of youth has to do, grease those fingers.
Rai says chill. Gaga Grumps says we end in double LL.
LL Creative One says chill.
Gaga Grumps says no H for chill.
Rory says et al.
Thanks for the follow.
The creative one says grill.
Gaga Grumps says grill works.
Well, creative one says grill.
Rory says grill.
Gaga Grumps says men no fireworks.
Rory says trill.
A creative one says drill.
Rory says frill.
Well, creative one says draft.
Well, creative one says draft as filler.
Gaga Grumps says okay, a filter with as many of those letters as possible.
Grumps says faked as filter.
Ari says drift for filler.
Gaga Grumps says draft is good. Gaga Grumps says krill, it must be unless I'm missing an option.
Thanks for the follow.
Good game.
Welcome, Gremlins, to the game grotto. Welcome, Gremlins, to the game grotto.
Welcoming
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Share us round. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it.
Rory
tap
says
it.
KBT.
It's your warm-up routine. Game Gremlins on the scene. Game Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says welcome Gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily heart, claim your points and prepare to play.
Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it. Game Gremlins, come and let's go. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it. Let's see those team stickers flow. Game Gremlins on the scene. Now tap that screen.
Rory says come on chat, we need to see the fireworks display.
Now tap that screen.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A, D. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Race to the top like a thon. Tap and don't stop like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned like a thon. Fingers on fire like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list.
Gremlins define.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says Rai back on top your word starting with D please Rai.
Grumps says treasure box is open.
Rare says don't.
Gaga Grumps says Delt you got.
Grumps says at Angie stop spamming.
Gaga Grumps says a greener lives at number 3 Wordle Street.
Rare says graph.
Gaga Grumps says brain fits. Gaga Grumps says no change 8 letters wiped from game. Gaga Grumps says bring on those fireworks.
Rare says quack.
Crystal says coach.
Gaga Grumps says coach works. Gaga Grumps says O moved into number 2.
Rare says foamy.
Grumps says at JENOR.
Gaga Grumps says foamy is a good shout.
Good game.
Rare says yes.
Thanks for the follow.
It's playtime! Gaga is in the box!
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat all green.
Don't let him push yours!
Crystal says nice red.
Let those stickers fly!
Good game.
Which team are you on? Team Gaga,
Good
give a
game.
cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you ready?
Good game.
Team Grumps, are you steady? Game! Gremlins, let's go! Game! Gremlins,
Good game.
let's go! Team
Gaga Grumps says Dooga Dooga Gaga. Share the live, chat the chat, and shower her with roses and GGs.
Good game. Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the GGs, Crystal.
Good game. Good game.
Grumps says at RYAN with the early phone.
Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says
Good
Ryan.
game.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says and still no fireworks for Gaga. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Crystal says mine says go popular, not available.
Gaga Grumps says him weird. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. Why? Gaga Grumps says is it in your fan gifts, Crystal? Gaga Grumps says next to the heart me usually. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon, tap and don't stop, like a thon, who will be crowned, like a thon, gremlin renowned, like a thon, fingers on fire, like a thon, gremlins.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Crystal says Yves forgot to send that one first.
Gaga Grumps says lol.
It's the freaking sniper!
Thanks for the follow.
Gaga Grumps says he's at it again.
Crystal says it didn't apply to your gift goal though.
Gaga Grumps says Grumps stole the crown. Gaga Grumps says probably changed the links then Crystal. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with Y please Grumps.
Grumps says yodel.
Gaga Grumps says fan campaign tells me to pin heart me. But it's not in the list to pin on Studio LOL.
Crystal says at Grumps, can you yodel?
Gaga Grumps says yodel you got. Gaga Grumps says a yellow L in need of a home.
Grumps says it Crystal, of course. I just need to stub my toe for it to kick in.
Rare says blank.
Colon Body says lumpy.
Colon Body says lumps.
Gaga Grumps says no plurals and that isn't how you spell ladies.
Grumps says at MB_CVGXXX no plurals.
Lion Lotus says lanky.
Gaga Grumps says he looks great in lederhosen lol.
Crystal says at Grumps law right.
Gaga Grumps says lilac fits.
Crystal says it Gaga and Grumps.
Grumps says at Gaga and Grumps I haven't worn any in over 50 years.
Miss Keller Nia says villa.
Gaga Grumps says nice word one.
Crystal says villa.
Gaga Grumps says bring on the fireworks.
Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says here we go.
Explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks for Gaga. Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee.
Rare says fireworks.
Emojis make her happy. As in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet.
Gaga Grumps says Wordle in 3. Let's see those fireworks in the chat.
Rare says finally fireworks.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat. Gaga Grumps says bout bloody time ha. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart Gameiferian Colin. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. B.
Grumps says at Maya Whiteheart no. Welcome Eggs and Bacon to Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the hand heats crystal.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says eggs in the house. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Race to the top like a thon. Tap and don't stop like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned like a thon. Fingers
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list.
hearts be flying like a thon. Gremlins define.
Eggs and Bacon says he'll steal the second word long.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says as always. Gaga Grumps says Rai with the last second snipe on Grumps. Payback. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with B please Rai.
Grumps says blame needs to be dished out.
Rory says Butte.
Gaga Grumps says Butte you got. Colin Body says finger sore from tapping lol.
Eggs and Bacon says early.
Gaga Grumps says yellow E and are in need of a home.
Rory says eager.
Miss Galania says lager. Gaga Grumps says don't tap so hard Colin lol.
Eggs and Bacon says early.
Colin Body says ladle.
Gaga Grumps says let's give Eggs his second word chance. Gaga Grumps says he honed the A in number 2 and added a homeless L.
Eggs and Bacon says later.
Rory says panel.
Eggs and Bacon says MVM.
Miss Elenius says labs.
Gaga Grumps says panel works. Gaga Grumps says E and L moved into 4 and 5.
Eggs and Bacon says camel.
Rare says Ezo.
Miss Galanias says camel. Rare says gavel.
Gaga Grumps says camel is a shout.
Miss Galania says Hazel.
Gaga Grumps says, but it gave us the humo.
Colon Body says lapel. Eggs and Bacon says filter word needed. Rory says gavel hazel.
Gaga Grumps says okay, what options do we have?
Eggs and Bacon says Hazel.
Gaga Grumps says Hazel it is.
Rai says Hazel.
Thanks for the follow.
Gaga Grumps says we tried camel belly.
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Eggs and Bacon says good use of filter word.
A random star chosen by fate. Play a part, it's a live date. Wordle with Gaga. Wordle with Gaga. Ra-da-da. Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says not sure filter was necessary with 2 guesses, but helped in case we missed something.
Only in 3. A pretty sky.
Gaga Grumps says do you do the daily Wordle? I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results.
Wordle with Gaga. Da-da-da. Wordle with Gaga.
We would be honored if you would join
Gaga
us.
Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart craft, Ella. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Grumps says at Shay McIntyre higher.
Crafter Ella Headquarters says quote.
Gaga Grumps says he didn't predict but he got.
Grumps says are you fracking kidding me?
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. Q. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thon, race to the top. Like a thon, tap and don't stop. Like a thon, who will be crowned? Like a thon, gremlin renowned. Like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with Q, please Rai. LL Creative One says Grumps fave letter.
Rory says quiet.
Or Creative One says no snipe.
Gaga Grumps says yep, and he didn't predict it this time.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says quiet you got.
Colin Body says axiom.
Gaga Grumps says a yellow E in need of a home.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says summer in the house.
Gamer Fairy for 120 says sure.
Rory says ample.
Colin Body says zebra.
Gaga Grumps says sure fits.
Creative 1 says trade.
Miss Elenius says scare.
Grumps says it's summer higher.
Gaga Grumps says we start with S removed into 4 and 5.
Gamer Fairy 420 says scare spare.
Rare says snare.
Miss Elenius says snare.
Fireworks for Gaga.
Well, creative one says fake.
It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks for Gaga.
Rare says spare.
Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for Gaga. Thanks for the follow. Emojis make her happy.
Miss Elenius says spare.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for
Gaga
Gaga.
Grumps says spare is in the grid.
Creative 1 says spare.
Gaga Grumps says you know what's coming.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says Wordle in 3. Let's see those fireworks in the chat. Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Shout! It's Cooper!
Gaga Grumps says and now a little wiggle.
It's Cooper! Wiggle butt, just a little mud with the wiggle butt. Gremlin say what? He's a corgi, don't you know? His name is Cooper, watch him go. Wiggle butt, just a little mud with a wiggle butt. Gremlin say what? With a wiggle butt, just a little mud with a wiggle butt. Gremlin say what? With a wiggle butt. That cute and fluffy puffball tail, Cooper, we do, yeah. Wiggle butt, just a little mud with a wiggle butt. Gremlin say what? With a wiggle butt.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says, and it didn't post my thanks, but I did send on Crystal lol. Gaga Grumps says, let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says, what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Crystal says MPST welcome.
Crystal says gotta go now.
Grumps says, just for the sake of it.
Gaga Grumps says, thank you for coming, Crystal, have a good day. Gaga Grumps says, we are starting with A. M.
Grumps says at Crystal it's the final 15 minutes.
Crystal says at Gaga and Grumps you too dear.
Gaga Grumps says, leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Grumps says it no plurals.
Crystal says at Grumps zone.
Grumps says at Crystal have a good Saturday.
Gaga Grumps says, want to steal the starting word? Send the ranking crown and snipe the list.
Crystal says at Grumps you to body.
Grumps says it never gonna be right though.
Gaga Grumps says, I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Grumps says, am I the only one tapping?
Gaga Grumps says, was everyone else like band lol? Gaga Grumps says, your word starting with M please Grumps.
Grumps says mouse.
Profabian 777 says mummy.
Gaga Grumps says, mouse you got. Gaga Grumps says, a yellow E in need of a home.
Grumps says at MOA higher.
Gaga Grumps says, hello Fitz.
Grumps says no oh.
Gaga Grumps says, or not. I got shouted at lol. Gaga Grumps says hello doesn't work.
Grumps says at MOA no o. Grumps says feral.
Gaga Grumps says Yaya Sigma. Gaga Grumps says feral fits. Gaga Grumps says I moved into number 4E still homeless. Gaga Grumps says I see a word. Gaga Grumps says could it be cheap? Gaga Grumps says if no other suggestions I'm spinning it.
Grumps says an act.
Gaga Grumps says we have an hay in the middle.
Grumps says wheat.
Gaga Grumps says good shout Annalise.
Good game.
Welcome, Gremlins, to the game grotto. Welcome, Gremlins, to the game grotto.
Gaga Grumps says
Welcome
GG
in,
Gremlins.
guys.
Let's see those W's in the chat.
Grab your heartbeat, share us round. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, it's your warm-up routine.
Good game.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says welcome Gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily heart, claim your points and prepare to play.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Good game.
Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, Game Gremlins.
Gaga Grumps says welcome Gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily heart, claim your points and Gaga Grumps says Fofo in the house.
Good game.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Good
Now
game.
tap that screen.
Papa Star says thank you, Gaga.
Now tap that screen.
Good game. Good game.
Now tap that screen.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up
Gang
next
gremlins
week.
on the scene.
Benjamin is in the house.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the roses, fofo. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. N.
Fafa Star says nylon.
Gaga Grumps says hi Kayla, how goes it? Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Rare says at Gaga and Grumps.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the rank and crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says yes, Ryra. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with N, please, Rai.
Rari says neath.
Gaga Grumps says neath you got. Gaga Grumps says a yellow tea in need of a home.
Rari says doubt.
Gaga Grumps says hi Jai. Gaga Grumps says doubt fits. Gaga Grumps says no plurals in Wordle Kayla. Gaga Grumps says nice word, we have a partial anagram.
Rory says turbo.
Rory says let's get fireworks.
Gaga Grumps says will turbo bring the fireworks.
Rory says yes.
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for Lyra.
Fireworks for Gaga. Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for Gaga. Emojis
Gaga Grumps says Wordle in 3. Let's see those fireworks in the chat.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet. Anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Rory says just amazing.
Gaga Grumps says okay, last grid coming up. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. F. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Race to the top like a thon. Tap and don't stop like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon?
Gaga Grumps says want to steal the starting word. Send the ranking crown and snipe the list. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with F, please, Rai.
Rory says feast.
Gaga Grumps says hi Charlotte. Gaga Grumps says feast you got. Gaga Grumps says a yellow A in need of a home. Gaga Grumps says no Eva apple.
Rory says agony.
Gaga Grumps says needs an A lily. Gaga Grumps says and no need to spam. Gaga Grumps says agony fits. Gaga Grumps says we start with A and O needs a home.
Raya Rai says allow.
Gaga Grumps says abhor works. Gaga Grumps says O moved into number 4 and R needs a home.
Rory says arrow.
Gaga Grumps says there's no R in audio. Gaga Grumps says arrow is a shout.
Rory says yes.
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat. Gaga Grumps says thanks for joining me to play Wordle. I will be back at 4 PM UK tomorrow for more Wordle with Gaga.
Top VRFS says hello.
Wordle with Gaga. Wordle with Gaga. Will the fireworks fly?
Gaga Grumps says hello and goodbye lol.
A random star chosen by fate. Play a part, it's a live date.
Gaga Grumps says do you do the daily Wordle? I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results.